The night was supposed to be quiet. The small house in Houston lay still, its windows glowing faintly against the dark Texas sky. Inside, Emily Parker, 5 months pregnant, stood by the kitchen counter, one hand resting gently on her belly. Her breath was heavy, her mind weighed down by endless worry. She had cooked dinner, hoping to please her husband Mark and maybe avoid another fight. But fate had other plans. Mark stumbled into the kitchen, his shirt untucked, the smell of alcohol rolling off him like a storm. His eyes, once warm and loving, were now cold and sharp. He slammed his keys on the table, startling Emily. "Why is the food cold?" he growled. His voice, deep and harsh, made Emily's heart skip. She tried to explain, whispering softly, "I was waiting for you, Mark. I didn't know when you'd be home." But instead of listening, Mark grabbed her arm. His grip was tight, cruel. Emily winced but held her breath, not wanting to anger him further. "You're useless," he spat. "Pregnant and slow, always dragging me down." The words cut deeper than a knife. Emily felt her eyes sting, but she swallowed her tears. She had endured insults before, but that night, Mark's anger was different, darker, more dangerous. He shoved her toward the stove, the burner still lit with a flickering blue flame. Emily gasped, clutching her belly, trying to steady herself, but Mark's rage boiled over. In a terrifying instant, he forced her hand down toward the flame. The fire licked her skin, searing pain shooting up her arm. Emily screamed, the sound piercing the walls, but no one came. Her body trembled as the smell of burning flesh filled the air. Tears streamed down her face, her cries echoing in the small kitchen. "Stop, Mark, please. The baby," she begged, her voice breaking. But her husband's grip tightened, his face twisted with fury. For a moment, it felt like he wanted to destroy her completely. Finally, he released her, pushing her back against the counter. Emily collapsed, cradling her burned hand, shaking uncontrollably. The pain was unbearable, but even worse was the terror flooding her heart. She looked up at Mark, who sneered down at her as if she were nothing. Her world shattered in that moment. She wasn't just a wife anymore. She was a prisoner, trapped in her own home, with no one to protect her and her unborn child. The betrayal, the cruelty, the fire, it was all too much. But deep inside her, a spark ignited. Between the tears and the pain, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the faint pulse of defiance. She clutched her belly, whispering silently to her child, "I'll protect you. I swear I will." And as she lifted her tear-streaked face, the faint glow in her eyes said it all. This was not the end. What Emily didn't know was that this single night of fire and cruelty would ignite a storm that would change everything. Forever. Years before the fire and the tears, Emily Parker had been a different woman. She was younger, full of light, and carried dreams of a peaceful life. Back then, she believed in love. She believed in Mark. They had met at a small diner just outside Houston. Emily was sitting alone, flipping through her accounting textbooks, her hair tucked behind her ear, when Mark walked in. He was tall, confident, and had that kind of easy smile that made strangers feel like friends. He noticed her struggling to balance a cup of coffee in her pile of books. Without hesitation, he reached over and helped. "Here, let me," he had said, his voice warm and kind. Emily looked up and saw something in his eyes. Gentleness, or so she thought. They talked for hours that evening, the conversation flowing like they had known each other forever. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt safe. Mark pursued her with persistence. He brought her flowers, left notes on her car, and called just to hear her voice. He said things like, "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever met, and I'll take care of you forever, no matter what." Emily's heart melted. She had grown up watching her parents struggle, and the idea of a strong man promising stability felt like a blessing. When Mark proposed, it was under the soft glow of Christmas lights. Emily had tears in her eyes as he slipped the ring on her finger. She believed she was saying yes to a lifetime of love and protection. The wedding was simple but beautiful. Family and friends gathered, and Emily wore a white lace dress her mother had saved up to buy. Mark held her hand tightly as they exchanged vows. He looked into her eyes and swore, "I will cherish you, Emily. In good times and bad, you'll never be alone." Everyone cheered. Emily's heart was full. That day, she thought she had won the world. The first year of marriage was everything she had dreamed of. Mark cooked breakfast on weekends, surprised her with little gifts, and told her she was his world. They laughed, planned their future, and even picked out names for the children they hoped to have. Emily kept a journal filled with their plans. Buying a bigger house, traveling, building a family together. But slowly, cracks began to show. Mark started working longer hours. At first, Emily thought it was for their future, but soon she noticed the smell of alcohol on his breath when he came home. He grew irritable, snapping at her over small things. She brushed it off, telling herself he was just stressed. After all, he still whispered, "I love you," when he wasn't angry. Then came the first time he raised his voice in public. The sting of embarrassment cut Emily, but she forgave him. She always forgave him, clinging to the memory of the man who once held her so gently in that diner. She didn't know it yet, but the promises of forever were already fading. The man who had sworn to protect her was slowly becoming the very storm that would destroy her peace. And soon, Emily would realize that her sweetest memories were only the mask hiding the nightmare to come. The glow of love had long faded. By the time Emily Parker was 5 months pregnant, her life had turned into a quiet prison. The small suburban house in Houston, which she once thought would be a safe haven, now felt like a cage with invisible bars. Each morning began the same. Emily would wake early, her hand instinctively resting on the growing curve of her belly. She whispered soft words to her unborn child, trying to convince herself that one day, everything would get better. But when she stepped into the kitchen and saw the piles of unpaid bills, the truth pressed down like a heavy weight. Mark controlled all the money. Emily had given up her full-time job when he insisted she stay home during her pregnancy. "You should rest," he said at first, making it sound like he cared. But soon it became clear, it wasn't about care. It was about control. Every dollar she needed had to come from him, and every request for even the smallest thing was met with suspicion. "You don't need new clothes," he scoffed one evening as she shyly asked for maternity wear. "Stop wasting money." Emily lowered her head, too tired to argue. She wore the same stretched-out dresses, her body aching, but she stayed silent. She had no choice. The loneliness was worse than the poverty. Mark often disappeared for hours, sometimes days, claiming work kept him busy. But Emily knew better. She smelled the alcohol on his clothes, caught faint traces of perfume that wasn't hers, and saw messages flashing briefly on his phone before he snatched it away. When she tried to ask, his temper flared. "Don't question me," he snapped. "I'm the one keeping this roof over your head." So Emily stopped asking. She kept her questions locked inside, her only companion the life growing in her womb. She poured her love into her unborn child, talking to the baby when the nights grew unbearable. "It's just you and me, little one," she whispered through tears. "We'll be okay, Mommy promises." But deep down, she wasn't sure. Her family lived states away, and Mark had slowly cut her off from friends. Phone calls went unanswered, visits became rare, and soon Emily found herself completely isolated. The walls of the house closed in tighter each day, and silence became her constant companion. The only person who occasionally noticed was Mrs. Johnson, the elderly neighbor. Sometimes she would wave from her porch, asking kindly, "Are you doing all right, dear?" Emily always forced a smile and nodded. She couldn't bear to let the truth slip out. At night, when Mark came home drunk, Emily pretended to sleep, her body tense with fear. She prayed he would stumble straight to bed and leave her alone. Some nights he did. Other nights, his anger spilled over into cruel words that pierced deeper than blows. She had once believed she was building a family. Instead, she was surviving a storm. And though she didn't know it yet, the storm was about to turn violent in ways she never imagined. Because soon, the pain of loneliness would be replaced by something far more terrifying, pain made of fire. The man Emily had once adored was gone. What stood in his place was Mark Parker, a shadow of the husband she thought she married. His transformation had been slow, but by now, there was no denying it. The sweet, caring man from the diner had become a stranger who thrived on control, anger, and deception. Mark's descent began with alcohol. At first, Emily brushed it off. "He just needs to relax after work," she told herself. But the bottles started stacking up. Beer cans littered the trash, whiskey lined the kitchen counter. He stumbled through the door at all hours, reeking of liquor, his eyes glassy, his voice slurred. Drunken nights always turned ugly. He would slam cabinet doors, curse under his breath, and lash out over the smallest things. Once, when Emily accidentally dropped a glass, Mark exploded. "Can't you do anything right?" he shouted, shards scattering across the floor like her broken heart. But alcohol wasn't his only vice. There were whispers of gambling debts. Emily overheard phone calls filled with anger and threats, men demanding money Mark didn't have. When she asked him about it, he snapped, "Stay out of my business." Then came the women. Emily noticed the signs: lipstick stains on his collar, text messages erased quickly, unexplained late nights. One evening, she found a receipt for a fancy dinner, the date and time matching a night he had told her he was working late. Her stomach turned as she realized he had been with someone else. Mark didn't even try to hide it anymore. "You're boring now," he sneered when she confronted him timidly. "Pregnant and nagging all the time? You think any man would want that?" His words cut deeper than any blade. Emily's hand instinctively touched her belly, shielding her unborn child from the poison dripping from his mouth. His cruelty grew bolder. In front of neighbors, he barked orders at her as if she were a servant. At family gatherings, he belittled her, calling her slow and useless, making jokes about her weight while others laughed nervously. Emily's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she stayed silent, swallowing the shame. Behind closed doors, the abuse escalated. Mark grabbed her arm so hard it left bruises. He shoved her against walls, his face twisted with rage. "Don't make me regret marrying you," he snarled more than once. Emily wanted to scream, to fight back, but fear paralyzed her. And yet, despite the darkness, she still clung to fragments of hope. She told herself it was stress, that maybe fatherhood would change him. Maybe, once the baby arrived, Mark would remember the love they once shared. But deep inside, a quiet voice whispered the truth. The man she had loved was gone, and in his place stood a monster. The world saw Mark as a successful man, a hard-working employee, a charismatic neighbor. But Emily knew better. She had seen the darkness behind closed doors, the monster that no one else believed existed. And soon, everyone would see it too, when his betrayal became impossible to hide. Her name was Sophie Miller, and from the outside, she looked harmless. With her neatly styled blonde hair, carefully painted smile, and soft voice, Sophie had mastered the art of appearing innocent. She worked as Mark Parker's assistant at the construction company, and to everyone around them she was polite, dependable, and professional. But Emily would soon learn that behind Sophie's gentle mask lived a woman with sharp claws and colder ambition than anyone imagined. Mark first mentioned Sophie casually, saying she was a big help at work. Emily, naive and still clinging to hope, smiled and encouraged him. "I'm glad you have someone to ease your workload," she said. She wanted to believe Mark was loyal, that maybe the long hours and late nights were real. But a wife's intuition is sharp, and Emily began to sense something was terribly wrong. It started with little things. Mark came home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. He carried his phone everywhere, even into the bathroom, and when messages popped up, he flipped the screen over quickly. One evening, Emily noticed a gold bracelet in the passenger seat of his car. When she asked, Mark's voice was icy. "Don't touch things that aren't yours." The truth began to unfold when Emily saw them together. She had gone to the office to bring Mark lunch, hoping to surprise him. Instead, she froze in the doorway as Sophie leaned across his desk, her laughter soft and intimate. Mark's hand brushed hers, and for a moment they looked like lovers, not co-workers. When he noticed Emily standing there, his face hardened. "You shouldn't be here," he barked, while Sophie smiled sweetly, as if she had done nothing wrong. That smile haunted Emily. It wasn't the smile of a kind woman, it was the smile of someone who knew she was winning. Behind the scenes, Sophie was clever. She pretended to care about Emily, sending little gestures of false kindness. "You must be so tired with the pregnancy," she cooed once, pressing a hand on Emily's arm. "Don't worry, I'll take care of Mark at work." Her words dripped with fake sympathy, but her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. To Mark, Sophie played the role of the supportive lover. She listened to his complaints, flattered his ego, and fed his desires. She whispered promises of freedom, painting Emily as a burden holding him back. "Imagine life without all that nagging," she said sweetly. "Just you and me, living the life you deserve." And Mark believed her. Emily, left at home, grew more isolated. Every time she confronted him, Mark turned the blame on her. "You're paranoid. Sophie is just an assistant." But deep down, Emily knew the truth. Sophie was more than that. She was the wedge driving her marriage apart, the flame fueling Mark's betrayal. What Emily didn't know yet was that Sophie's ambitions stretched far beyond stolen kisses. Sophie didn't just want Mark's affection, she wanted everything: his money, his status, his life. And Emily was the only obstacle standing in her way. It was a Saturday evening when Emily experienced her first deep cut of humiliation in front of others. Mark had insisted they attend a family dinner at his parents' house. Emily had hesitated. Her pregnancy made her tired, her swollen feet ached, and her burned hands still throbbed from the night. Mark forced it on the stove. But he gave her no choice. "Don't embarrass me by staying home," he ordered. So Emily went. She dressed in the best she had, a simple floral dress that barely fit her growing belly. She tied her hair back and placed a shaky smile on her face, hoping to avoid any conflict. The house was filled with laughter and chatter when they arrived. Mark's family always adored him. To them, he was the successful son, the man who provided, the golden child. No one saw the darkness he carried behind closed doors. And Mark made sure to keep it that way. At first, things were polite. Emily sat quietly at the dining table, answering questions with soft nods. "How's the baby coming along?" Mark's mother asked sweetly. Emily smiled and placed a hand on her stomach. "The baby is healthy, thank God." But then, as plates were passed and glasses filled, Mark's mask slipped. "Emily is eating enough for 2. Maybe 3, he joked loudly, smirking at Sophie, who had somehow been invited as well, under the excuse of being a trusted employee. Laughter erupted around the table. Emily froze, her cheeks burning hot. She lowered her eyes, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. When she reached for a piece of bread, Mark swatted her hand lightly but harshly enough for others to notice. "Careful," he said with mock concern. "If you eat too much, you won't be able to fit through the door." The room burst into uncomfortable chuckles. Emily's throat tightened. Tears pressed at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back. She wouldn't cry here, not in front of them, not while Sophie's satisfied smile lingered across the table. As the night dragged on, the insults continued. Mark complained about her laziness, how she slept all day while he worked hard. He spoke about the bills piling up as if Emily were the reason for every financial problem. Each word landed like a stone on her chest, and no one defended her. His sisters looked away awkwardly. His father laughed along. His mother patted Emily's hand weakly, whispering, "He's just joking, dear. Don't take it to heart." But the truth was clear. No one wanted to see Mark for who he really was. By dessert, Emily felt like she couldn't breathe. She excused herself, slipping quietly into the bathroom. Once inside, she locked the door and collapsed onto the cold tile floor. Silent sobs shook her body. She pressed her hands against her swollen belly and whispered, "I'm so sorry, baby. I don't know how much longer I can take this." When she returned to the table, her face was pale but dry. She sat in silence, her head bowed, enduring until the night ended. But deep inside, something shifted. This was no longer just about surviving Mark's cruelty. It was about saving her child from a life of shame. The nights were the hardest. When the world outside grew quiet and the streets of Houston fell still, Emily Parker's house filled with a silence that weighed heavier than stone. It was in these hours, after Mark had stumbled into bed reeking of liquor or failed to come home at all, that Emily's heart cracked open. She often sat alone in the living room, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Her burned hand, still scarred and tender, rested carefully on her lap. With her other hand, she cradled her belly, feeling the faint kicks of the life inside her. Those gentle movements were her only comfort, proof that she was not entirely alone. Sometimes she whispered to the child, her voice trembling but soft, "I know you can't understand me yet, but you're the only one I can talk to. You're my little miracle." Tears slid down her cheeks, and she wiped them quickly, as if someone might catch her crying. Mark's absence had become routine. He stayed out late, drinking or hiding with Sophie, while Emily stared at the clock, waiting for sounds that never came. When he did come home, it was worse. He would stagger in, slam doors, mutter curses, and collapse into bed without a glance at her. If she dared to ask where he had been, his anger erupted like fire. so she stopped asking. But the silence was its own kind of cruelty. Emily longed for a voice to answer her, a hand to hold hers, someone to say, "It's gonna be okay." Yet all she had was the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and the muffled sound of her own sobs. One night, after another humiliating dinner with Mark's family, Emily sat on the edge of her bed, holding her belly tightly. The baby kicked, and she whispered, "Do you hear that? That's you telling me to keep going." Her tears wet the pillow as she curled up on her side, rocking gently to soothe both herself and the little one she carried. Her dreams, when she managed to sleep, were haunted. Sometimes she dreamed of the past, the diner where she met Mark, the way he once looked at her with tenderness. But the dreams always twisted into nightmares. In them, his smile turned cruel, his hand gripped her arm too tightly, and the sound of Sophie's laughter echoed like poison in the background. She often woke with a gasp, clutching her chest, drenched in sweat. Every morning, Emily wiped her tears and put on a brave face. She told herself she had to endure, that the baby deserved a mother who didn't give up. But inside she was crumbling. Each night drained her a little more. Each day stretched longer, and hope seemed further out of reach. Still, one thought kept her alive, the baby. She whispered the same promise night after night, pressing her lips to her belly. "No matter what happens, I'll protect you. You'll never feel this pain. I swear it." What Emily didn't realize was that soon her whispered promises would be tested in the cruelest way imaginable, when the fire returned, not just to her heart, but to her flesh. It happened on a night that began like so many others. Mark had been out drinking, and Emily sat at home, her swollen feet resting on a cushion, her hand gently stroking her belly. She had prepared dinner hours earlier, chicken, rice, and vegetables, but the food sat untouched on the table, growing cold as the clock ticked past 9. When Mark finally burst through the door, his face was flushed, his steps uneven. The stench of whiskey filled the room. Emily tensed immediately, her heart beating faster. She tried to smile, tried to keep her voice steady. "Dinner is ready, Mark. I'll heat it up for you." But instead of gratitude, anger sparked in his bloodshot eyes. He slammed his keys down so hard the sound echoed through the kitchen. "Cold food again?" he barked. "Do you do anything right?" Emily lowered her gaze, her voice soft. "I waited for you. I didn't know when you'd be home." Her words only fueled his rage. He stepped closer, his presence towering over her. "You're useless," he spat. "All you do is sit here, eating and getting fat. You can't even keep my house warm with a hot meal." His words pierced her heart, but before she could reply, Mark's hand clamped around her wrist. Emily gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron. He dragged her toward the stove, his face twisted with fury. "Let me show you what hot feels like," he snarled. The burner was already lit, the blue flame flickering silently. Panic surged through Emily's chest. "Mark, please," she cried, her voice breaking. "I'm pregnant, the baby," but her plea fell on deaf ears. In one swift, brutal motion, he shoved her hand down toward the flame. The fire licked her skin instantly. Agony exploded through her body as the searing heat burned into her flesh. Emily screamed, the sound raw and piercing, echoing through the walls of the house. She tried to yank her hand free, but Mark's grip only tightened. The smell of scorched skin filled the kitchen, mixing with the stench of alcohol. Tears streamed down her face as she begged, "Please, stop! You're hurting me." But Mark's eyes were cold, almost lifeless, as if her suffering fed his twisted power. Finally, he let go, shoving her backward against the counter. Emily crumpled to the floor, clutching her burned hand, sobbing uncontrollably. Her entire body shook with terror and pain. She glanced at the stove, the flame still flickering innocently, as if mocking her torment. Mark stood above her, sneering. "Maybe now you'll learn to do things right," he muttered, before staggering out of the room, leaving her broken on the floor. Emily rocked back and forth, her tears falling onto her belly. She whispered hoarsely to her child, "I'm so sorry, baby. I'll protect you. I promise I'll protect you." Her burned hand throbbed, but the pain in her heart was even greater. And in that unbearable moment, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a spark ignited. What Mark didn't know was that this act of cruelty would awaken a strength in Emily he could never destroy. The burn on Emily's hand blistered quickly, turning red and raw. Every movement sent jolts of pain up her arm, She wrapped it in a damp cloth and rocking back and forth on the kitchen floor long after Mark had stumbled into bed. The house was silent again, but inside her chest, a storm raged louder than ever. She wanted to leave. For the first time, the thought screamed inside her head like a siren. Run. Get out. Take the baby and never look back. But as quickly as the thought rose, the cruel truth crushed it. Where could she go? Her family lived hundreds of miles away in another state, and Mark had worked hard to sever her ties with them. He convinced her to change her phone number, telling her, "We don't need anyone else. It's just us." Slowly, the calls and visits stopped. Now, if she showed up at their doorstep, burned, pregnant, and broken, would they even believe her? Or would they believe Mark, the charming man they had once admired? Her friends were gone too. Mark made sure of that. "They're jealous of you," he would say whenever Emily mentioned them. Or worse, "I don't like you hanging out with people who don't respect me." Over time, Emily's circle shrank to nothing. She was alone, completely dependent on the man who hurt her. She shuffled into the bedroom quietly, not wanting to wake him. Mark was sprawled across the bed, snoring loudly, the stink of whiskey heavy in the air. Emily sat at the edge of the mattress, clutching her belly with her good hand. Her tears dripped onto the blanket as she whispered, "What am I going to do?" For a moment, dark thoughts crept in. She wondered if the baby would be better off without her, if escaping the pain meant letting go forever. The idea terrified her, and she pushed it away, clinging desperately to the tiny kicks inside her. "No," she whispered fiercely. "I can't leave you. You're all I have." The next morning, Mark acted as though nothing had happened. He dressed for work, humming under his breath, while Emily hid her burned hand beneath a sleeve. When she dared to glance at him, he smirked. "Don't look so dramatic. You'll live." Then he walked out the door, leaving her to drown in silence. Emily wandered through the house, every room echoing with emptiness. The walls seemed to close in, and the air felt heavy. She thought about packing a bag, but her body froze. If she left and Mark found her, what would he do? The fear paralyzed her more than the fire ever had. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she felt the baby kick again. It was stronger this time, almost insistent. She placed both hands on her belly and whispered, "You're the reason I'll keep fighting. I don't know how yet, but I will." She didn't know that soon. An unlikely ally would notice her suffering, and that spark of hope would begin to grow. For weeks after the night of fire, Emily tried to hide the burn on her hand. She wore long sleeves, even in the warm Houston sun, and smiled faintly whenever anyone asked how she was doing. But pain has a way of slipping through cracks, and one person noticed: the neighbor across the street, Grace Johnson. Grace was in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled into a bun and eyes that carried both kindness and sorrow. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades and had seen more than her fair share of broken families. Her own marriage had ended years ago, after she finally escaped the fists of a violent husband. Since then, she made it her quiet mission to watch over others, especially women who seemed too fragile, too alone. From her porch, Grace often saw Emily standing by the mailbox, her shoulders slumped, her eyes distant. Some days she noticed Emily wince when she used her hand. Other times she saw her rushing indoors quickly whenever Mark's car pulled into the driveway, as if afraid of being caught outside too long. One morning, Grace decided to speak up. She walked across the street with a basket of freshly baked muffins. Knocking gently on the door, she smiled when Emily answered. "Just thought you could use a little something sweet," she said warmly. Emily forced a smile, murmuring a thank you, but Grace didn't miss the way her eyes flickered nervously, as if expecting someone to appear behind her. Over the next few days, Grace made small gestures, waving from her garden, stopping by with extra groceries, asking harmless questions. Slowly, Emily began to soften. One afternoon, as Grace handed her a jar of homemade jam, Emily's sleeve slipped back, revealing the angry red scar across her hand. Grace's heart tightened. She had seen burns like that before. She looked directly into Emily's eyes and asked quietly, "Did he do this to you?" Emily froze, panic rushing through her body. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Tears welled in her eyes as she quickly pulled her sleeve down. I burned it while cooking," she whispered, but her trembling voice betrayed her. Grace didn't push. She simply placed a gentle hand on Emily's arm and said, "I know what it feels like to be trapped. You don't have to say anything now. Just know, I see you, and you're not as alone as you think." Those words cracked something inside Emily. That night, she lay awake replaying them over and over. You're not as alone as you think. For the first time in months, a flicker of hope stirred inside her. Grace continued to watch over her, sometimes leaving notes in Emily's mailbox. "You are stronger than you know." Sometimes it was a simple wave, a nod, a reminder that someone cared. And Emily clung to those small lifelines like air. What Emily didn't realize was that Grace would soon become far more than a kind neighbor. She would become the key to her survival, and the weapon Mark never saw coming. The days following their quiet exchange felt different for Emily. Grace Johnson's words, "You're not as alone as you think," echoed in her mind like a gentle anthem. For the first time in months, Emily felt a sliver of safety, as though someone had thrown her a lifeline in the middle of a raging storm. One afternoon, Grace invited Emily over under the pretense of sharing tea. Emily hesitated at first, afraid of what Mark might say if he discovered she'd been spending time with the neighbor. But the warmth in Grace's eyes melted her defenses, and she agreed. Grace's living room was cozy, filled with family photos, books stacked on shelves, and the scent of lavender drifting from a candle. Emily sat stiffly on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, while Grace poured tea into delicate china cups. They spoke of small things at first, the weather, the garden, the neighborhood. But Grace's gaze often drifted to Emily's scarred hand, and finally she spoke softly. "You don't have to explain it. I already know." Emily's throat tightened. She shook her head quickly. I can't talk about it." Grace reached across the table, her voice steady but kind. "I used to say the same thing, for years." Emily's eyes widened. Grace took a deep breath and continued. "My husband was a cruel man, charming in public, but behind closed doors he was a monster. I hid bruises under long sleeves, lied to neighbors, and told myself I had to endure. I thought love meant sacrifice. I thought silence meant survival." Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself. "One night, he hit me so hard I thought I wouldn't wake up, and I realized if I stayed, I would die. Not just me, but the woman I used to be. That was the day I chose to leave." Emily's heart pounded as she listened. Tears welled in her eyes. How did you do it? Weren't you scared?" "Terrified," Grace admitted. "But fear loses its power when you finally understand your worth. Leaving wasn't easy. People judged me, whispered behind my back, but I gained something far more important, freedom. And eventually, peace." Emily's tears spilled over. "I don't know if I'm strong enough. I don't have anyone. He controls everything." Grace squeezed her hand gently. "You have more strength than you realize. I see it in the way you carry yourself, even when you're broken, and you're not alone anymore. You have me, and you have that baby. That child is counting on you to fight." Emily clutched her belly, feeling a small kick, as if the baby agreed. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future without Mark. The thought scared her, but it also lit a tiny flame of hope. Grace leaned closer, her voice firm. "Promise me something, Emily. Promise me you won't give up. Promise me you'll start thinking about what life could look like without him." Emily nodded through her tears. "I promise." And in that moment, a fragile but powerful shift began. Emily was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to dream of freedom. After her conversation with Grace, something inside Emily shifted. For months, she had been living like a shadow, existing only to survive each day. But now, a seed of courage had been planted. Grace's story became a mirror of what could be, proof that escape was possible. For Emily, survival was no longer enough. She needed a way out, and she needed proof strong enough to protect her and her unborn child. She began quietly. The next time Mark exploded in anger and shouted cruel words, she kept her face blank, but her mind was racing. Late that night, when he was passed out in bed, she took his old phone charger and wired it to an old recording device Grace had given her. "Keep it hidden," Grace had whispered. "Sometimes the truth needs a voice louder than yours." Emily slipped the device under the couch cushion, where it would capture Mark's rage during their next argument. Her heart pounded with fear as she hid it, terrified he might notice. But Mark never suspected. He was too consumed by his own ego to believe she would fight back. Days turned into weeks, and Emily grew bolder. She recorded phone calls where Mark shouted at debt collectors, threatening them with money he didn't have. She snapped photos of bruises on her arms, careful to angle the camera so the shadows revealed every mark. Once, when Mark shoved her against the wall and stormed out, she pressed her swollen belly and whispered, "One day, this will all be over. I'm making sure of it." But the hardest evidence to gather was of Sophie. Emily knew their affair was deeper than casual meetings. Mark spent money recklessly, yet the bills at home piled up unpaid. Where was it going? One afternoon while he showered, she mustered every ounce of courage and unlocked his briefcase. Inside, she found hotel receipts, jewelry boxes, and even a handwritten note in Sophie's delicate script. "Soon, it will just be us." Emily's stomach twisted, but she took photos quickly, her hands shaking as she returned everything to its place. The evidence burned in her phone, but it also gave her power. She started keeping a hidden folder under her bed, a collection of documents, recordings, and pictures. Each piece was a brick in the wall she was building against Mark. Every time she added to it, she felt a little stronger. At night, she still whispered to her unborn child, but her words began to change. "I'll protect you" became, "I'm getting ready for us." The fear hadn't vanished, but now it was joined by determination. One evening, Grace looked her in the eye and asked, "Are you ready for the day when you'll finally show him who you are?" Emily hesitated, then nodded firmly. "Not yet, but soon." What she didn't know was that her silent preparations would uncover something even darker than abuse. Mark's secrets went far beyond violence, and the betrayal she was about to discover would shake her to her core. Emily thought she had already seen the worst of Mark Parker, the violence, the drinking, the affair with Sophie. But the deeper she looked, the darker the truth became. Her small folder of evidence was growing thicker, but one discovery threatened to shatter everything she believed about the man she once called her husband. It started with a letter. One morning, while collecting the mail, Emily noticed an envelope stamped with bold red letters. "Urgent. Final notice." She tucked it into her dress pocket before Mark could see. When she opened it later in her room, her heart pounded. It wasn't just a bill, it was a legal warning. Mark owed thousands of dollars to the bank. If he didn't pay, their house could be seized. Her hands shook as she read. Mark had been gambling more than she realized, pulling out loans in both of their names without telling her. He wasn't just a cruel husband, he was dragging her and their unborn child into financial ruin. Determined to know more, Emily searched through his office when he left for work. She opened drawers quietly, her ears straining for any sound of his return. What she found made her breath catch. Forged signatures, fake contracts, and stacks of unpaid invoices. She took photos of everything, her heart racing with each click of the camera. Then, hidden beneath a pile of folders, she found something worse. A transfer form. Large sums of money being funneled directly into an account under Sophie Miller's name. Emily's stomach dropped. Sophie wasn't just a mistress, she was his partner in crime. Her mind spun as she pieced it together. The late nights, the expensive dinners, the jewelry boxes. Mark wasn't spending money on Sophie. He was moving money to Sophie. And it wasn't his money. It was stolen. That evening, Emily sat on her bed, staring at the photos on her phone. Every piece of evidence told a story she hadn't wanted to face. Mark wasn't just betraying her body and her heart. He was betraying the law. And Sophie wasn't just stealing her husband, she was helping him destroy everything they had left. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound. Emily pressed her burned hand against her chest, whispering through tears, "How could you do this to us, Mark? To your own child?" When Grace came by that night, Emily finally opened up. She showed her the documents, the receipts, the transfers. Grace's eyes hardened. "He's not just abusive, Emily, he's a criminal. And Sophie, she's not going to stop until she takes everything." Emily swallowed hard. Fear gripped her, but so did resolve. "Then I have to stop them," she whispered. "For my baby. For me." Grace nodded firmly. "Good, but you need to be careful. Men like him, they get desperate when the truth is close." Emily's hands trembled as she closed her folder, now heavier with damning evidence. The weight of it was crushing, but it was also the first real weapon she had. What Emily didn't know was that Sophie was already preparing her next move, a lie so big it would threaten to erase Emily from Mark's life forever. Emily had always suspected Sophie was dangerous, but she hadn't expected just how far the young woman was willing to go. The truth came one evening when Mark returned home earlier than usual, his face flushed with excitement rather than anger. He tossed his jacket on the chair, poured himself a drink, and smirked at Emily. "You're not the only one carrying a baby anymore," he said coldly. Emily froze, her heart slamming in her chest. "What? What do you mean?" Mark's grin widened. "Sophie's pregnant. She's giving me the son I've always wanted. A real family." The words sliced through Emily like a knife. She stumbled backward, clutching her belly protectively. Her voice cracked. "That's impossible." But Mark only laughed, cruel and dismissive. "Impossible? No, she's everything you're not. She's young, beautiful, supportive, and she doesn't complain like you do." Emily's vision blurred with tears. She knew Sophie was manipulative, but claiming a pregnancy? It was a weapon designed to destroy her completely. Mark didn't even hesitate. He believed Sophie's lie without question. That night, Emily sat in her room, trembling. The baby inside her kicked gently, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. But the fear was overwhelming. If Sophie convinced Mark that her baby was his true heir, where did that leave Emily and her child? Would he cast them aside like trash? The next day, Emily confided in Grace, her voice shaking with disbelief. "She says she's pregnant, Grace. And Mark, he's acting like it's the best thing that's ever happened to him." Grace's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with anger. "That girl is lying. I can see it from a mile away. She's using this to secure her place in his life, to take everything from you." Emily buried her face in her hands. "But what if he doesn't care? What if he chooses her anyway?" Grace leaned forward, gripping Emily's shoulders firmly. "Then you fight. You hold your ground. You have the real child, Emily. You carry the truth inside you, and soon you'll have the proof of his crimes. Don't let her lies break you before the truth comes out." Meanwhile, Sophie played her part perfectly. She flaunted her supposed pregnancy at Mark's office, walking around with a hand on her flat stomach, smiling sweetly whenever anyone asked. "Yes," she'd say, her voice dripping with innocence. "Mark and I are expecting. It's such a blessing." Mark beamed beside her, proud and oblivious. He paraded Sophie around, introducing her as if she were already part of his future. And every time Emily heard the whispers, her heart cracked further. But beneath her pain, determination grew. She knew Sophie's lie couldn't last forever. Pregnancies weren't words. They were visible, undeniable truths. Emily vowed she would expose Sophie, just as she would expose Mark. For now, she stayed quiet, watching, waiting, gathering strength. She would not let this false pregnancy erase her. Because the day was coming when Sophie's mask would fall. And when it did, the whole world would see the ugly truth behind her sweet smile. After Sophie's shocking claim of pregnancy, Emily realized something important. Open resistance would only feed Mark's anger and Sophie's lies. If she wanted to survive and win, she had to play a different role. She had to pretend. So she put on a mask. Emily began acting softer, quieter, almost obedient. When Mark barked at her to cook, she nodded and went to the kitchen. When he insulted her, she lowered her eyes and stayed silent. Even when he compared her cruelly to Sophie, she forced herself not to react. Inside, her heart burned, but on the outside, she appeared submissive. Exactly what Mark wanted to see. This change pleased him. "Finally," he sneered one evening as she quietly cleared the dishes, "you're learning your place." He thought he had broken her spirit. He didn't realize that behind her lowered gaze, Emily's mind was sharper than ever. With every insult she swallowed, she gained time. With every night she pretended to sleep, she gained opportunity. She continued collecting evidence, photos, recordings, financial documents, slipping them into the hidden folder under her bed. Grace helped her scan copies and save them onto a USB drive in case Mark ever found the originals. Meanwhile, Emily studied Sophie. Through whispered gossip and careful observation, she noticed cracks in Sophie's performance. Her stomach never grew, her excuses became flimsy, and once Emily even overheard her laughing with a friend. "Do you know how easy it is to trick a man who's desperate to believe he's loved?" The knowledge fueled Emily's resolve. Sophie's false pregnancy was a ticking time bomb, and Emily just had to wait for the right moment to expose it. At night, lying beside Mark's drunken snores, Emily whispered to her unborn child, "He thinks I'm weak. He thinks I'm blind. But we're stronger than he knows. We're going to win." Grace noticed the transformation too. "You're calmer," she remarked one afternoon as they sat in the garden. "But your eyes, they're not broken anymore. They're focused." Emily nodded. "I have to be careful. He can't suspect. If he knows what I'm planning, he'll destroy everything before I have a chance." Grace squeezed her hand. "Then keep pretending. But never forget, you're not the one who should be ashamed. They are." Every day, Emily rehearsed her silence. Every smile she forced was a shield, every nod a weapon. She was no longer just enduring Mark's cruelty. She was studying him, memorizing his weaknesses, waiting for the moment he'd slip. And Mark, blind with arrogance, gave her plenty of material. He boasted loudly about Sophie, about their future together, about how Emily was just temporary. Each word he spoke in confidence became another nail in his own coffin, as Emily captured them all. What he didn't know was that his quiet, submissive wife was building a storm around him. And when it struck, it would leave him with nothing. The Emily Parker who once cried quietly in the shadows was gone. Weeks of silent endurance had given birth to something new inside her, a fire, not of fear, but of strength. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Emily began to transform. It started with her mindset. Each morning, instead of dreading the day, she whispered to herself, "I'm not a victim. I'm preparing." She no longer saw herself as a prisoner. She was a soldier in disguise, waiting for the right moment to strike. The pain of her burned hand and the scars on her heart became reminders of why she couldn't give up. Grace guided her through the process. Together, they built not just evidence, but confidence. "Stand tall when you walk," Grace advised. "Don't let him see your fear, even if you feel it." Emily practiced in front of the mirror, straightening her shoulders, lifting her chin, letting her eyes harden with quiet resolve. For the first time in years, she saw a woman she recognized. Not the broken wife, but the girl who once dreamed of freedom. Then came the physical changes. Grace insisted she buy a few new clothes, modest but empowering. With her savings tucked secretly away from Mark's eyes, Emily purchased a fitted dress that hugged her baby bump proudly instead of hiding it. She wanted to look like a woman who owned her future, not one ashamed of it. She also cut her hair, trimming away the length that Mark loved to grab when he was angry. As the locks fell to the floor, she felt lighter, freer. When she looked in the mirror afterward, she saw a woman reborn. Her strength grew in small, defiant acts. At dinner, when Mark mocked her cooking, she no longer flinched. She looked him in the eye, calm and steady, giving him nothing to feed on. When Sophie tried to flaunt her fake pregnancy in front of her, Emily only smiled faintly, as if she knew a secret Sophie didn't, and deep down, she did. But the real change was inside. Emily no longer cried herself to sleep. Instead, she planned. She mapped out her steps carefully, when to release the recordings, when to present the financial documents, and when to confront Sophie's lie. She wasn't rushing. She was waiting for the perfect storm, the moment when both Mark and Sophie would be most exposed. At night, when the baby kicked, Emily spoke differently. "We're almost there," she whispered. "Your mom isn't afraid anymore. We're going to stand tall together." Grace noticed the difference. One evening as they shared tea, she smiled and said, "You look like a different person." Emily's lips curved into the smallest but fiercest smile. "I am." The woman who once bent under the weight of insults was now standing taller. The wife who once hid her scars was now preparing to use them as proof. The mother who once whispered apologies to her unborn child was now whispering promises of victory. Because Emily wasn't just surviving anymore, she was rising. And soon she would show Mark and Sophie exactly who she had become. The night Emily decided to confront Mark, the house felt different. The silence was thick, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She had spent weeks collecting evidence, recordings of his insults, photos of bruises, documents of his financial lies. But tonight wasn't about revealing it all. Tonight was about testing him, about showing she was no longer afraid. Mark walked in late, as usual, tossing his jacket over a chair. Sophie's perfume lingered faintly on his shirt. Emily waited in the kitchen, her folder hidden beneath the table. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm. "Dinner?" she asked softly, her voice steady. Mark poured himself a drink instead. "Don't bother. Sophie and I already ate," he smirked, daring her to react. For once, Emily didn't flinch. She opened the folder slowly and laid out a stack of papers on the table. Bank statements, loan warnings, receipts from hotels, all copies she had carefully made. Mark's smirk faltered as his eyes scanned the documents. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked sharply. "Proof," Emily said quietly. "Proof of what you've been doing. The gambling, the lies, the money you've been funneling to Sophie. And if I wanted to, I could show these to the police tomorrow." Mark slammed his glass down so hard it splashed across the counter. He stepped toward her, his face red with fury. "You think you can threaten me? You think anyone would believe you over me? You're a pathetic, hormonal wreck. Nobody will take you seriously." Emily's pulse raced, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I'm not threatening. I'm warning. I know what you've done, and I won't stay silent forever." For a brief second, Mark's eyes flickered with something she hadn't seen before: fear. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual arrogance. He shoved the papers back toward her. "Fake. All of it. You're trying to make me look bad because you can't handle being a real wife." Emily gathered the papers calmly, slipping them back into the folder. "Believe what you want, but you can't bury the truth forever." His hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. "Listen to me, Emily," he hissed. "If you ever try to ruin me, you'll regret it. Do you understand?" Her burned hand ached under his grip, but this time she didn't beg. She met his glare head-on, her voice low and firm. "No, Mark, it's you who's going to regret it." The tension in the room crackled like lightning. Mark finally released her, storming out with curses spilling from his mouth. The door slammed, shaking the walls. Emily exhaled shakily, her whole body trembling from the confrontation. But beneath the fear, a strange relief filled her. She had looked the monster in the eyes, and she hadn't broken. What Emily didn't know was that Mark was already planning his counterattack. And the next battle would not be fought in private, but in front of the entire world. The night of the company party arrived with glittering lights, flowing champagne, and the polished laughter of Houston's business elite. The grand ballroom gleamed with crystal chandeliers, the tables draped in white linen, and the air thick with pride. Mark thrived in this environment. He loved being the center of attention, parading Sophie at his side as though she were already his queen. Emily, however, entered quietly. Dressed in a simple but elegant black gown Grace had helped her choose, she looked calm, composed, and radiant with her baby bump. She drew curious glances, whispers following her steps. Many hadn't seen her at such an event in months. Some assumed she had retreated into obscurity. They didn't know she had been preparing for this very moment. Mark spotted her across the room, his smug grin faltering. "What are you doing here?" he hissed when she approached. Emily's voice was steady. "I'm here as your wife, unless you've forgotten." Sophie looped her arm through Mark's and sneered. "Don't make a scene, Emily. This is a celebration." Emily smiled faintly, her eyes sharp. "Oh, I won't make a scene. I'll reveal one." The music shifted, glasses clinked, and the company's CEO stepped up to the microphone to toast the evening. Mark beamed, raising his glass proudly. But before the toast ended, Emily stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "Before you all celebrate this man," she said firmly, "there are things you should know." The room hushed instantly. All eyes turned to Emily. Mark's face darkened. "Sit down, Emily," he growled under his breath. But she didn't. She pulled a small USB drive from her purse and handed it to the events technician. Within seconds, the large screen behind the podium flickered. Gasps rippled through the crowd as recordings played, Mark shouting vicious insults at her, threatening her, admitting debts. Then came images, receipts, contracts, and bank transfers. Names, dates, and numbers painted a picture of fraud, gambling, and theft. Emily's voice rose above the murmurs. "This is the man you trust. This is the man you praise. He isn't just unfaithful. He's a liar, a thief, and a criminal." Mark lunged toward her, his face red with fury. "You lying witch," he shouted. But before he could reach her, several executives blocked his path, their expressions grim. Then, as if the humiliation weren't enough, Emily turned to Sophie. "And as for you, tell them about your pregnancy." The crowd gasped again. Sophie stammered, her smile collapsing. I. But no words came. Her flat stomach betrayed her. The whispers grew louder, sharp and condemning. Emily's gaze was steady, her voice unshakable. "You tried to replace me with lies, but lies can't stand against truth." The CEO, pale and furious, gestured to security. "Get them out, both of them. Effective immediately." Mark thrashed, shouting curses, while Sophie slipped away, her face burning with shame. Emily stood tall, her chest heaving with both fear and triumph. She had done it. She had exposed them both. What she didn't know was that Mark's fall had only begun, and the law itself was about to come crashing down on him. The company party was only the beginning of Mark Parker's ruin. The moment Emily's evidence hit the screen, his carefully crafted image began to collapse like a house of cards. By the next morning, the whispers had turned into headlines. Local businessmen accused of fraud and abuse. The police showed up at his office with warrants in hand. Emily watched from her window as the squad car pulled away with Mark in the back seat, his once proud head hanging low. For a moment, she felt her chest rise with relief. Justice had finally arrived. But this wasn't just about her. It was about every bruise, every insult, every scar he had left on her soul. Watching him taken away wasn't just victory, it was vindication. The news spread quickly. Business partners withdrew, friends vanished, and neighbors whispered behind closed doors. The man who once stood tall, arrogant, and untouchable was now a criminal in the public eye. And then came Sophie. At first, she tried to distance herself, pretending she had no part in Mark's schemes. But investigators uncovered the bank transfers to her name, the expensive gifts, the hotel bills. Cornered, Sophie panicked. She struck a deal, turning over her part of the evidence in exchange for leniency. Mark never saw it coming. From his cell, he begged her to stand by him. "You said you loved me," he shouted during one supervised phone call. Sophie's voice was cold as ice. "I loved the money, Mark, and now you have nothing." Then she hung up, leaving him screaming into the receiver. Emily heard about it from Grace, who smiled grimly. "Poetic justice," she said. "He threw you away for her, and now she's thrown him away for herself." The trial was brutal. Witnesses testified, evidence piled up, and Mark's arrogance finally cracked. The recordings Emily had kept, the ones of his insults, his threats, were played in court. The jury listened, horrified. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts, Mark's face was pale and lifeless. He was sentenced to several years in prison. For Emily, it was the end of one nightmare. For Mark, it was the beginning of his own. Prison stripped him of everything: his wealth, his pride, his power. The men who once envied him now mocked him. Sophie disappeared from his life entirely, moving on with someone else, while his name became a stain on every conversation. By the time he was released years later, he was no longer the strong, arrogant man he once pretended to be. He was thinner, weaker, his eyes hollow. With no money, no family, and no friends, he drifted into a small, lonely apartment on the edge of the city. And then came the final blow: his health. A stroke left him partially paralyzed, his once commanding voice slurred, his body frail. Alone and forgotten, Mark Parker spent his days staring out a cracked window, haunted by the ghosts of the choices he made. The man who once burned his pregnant wife's hand now sat in silence, burned by his own greed, his own cruelty, and by the justice he thought he could outrun. The years that followed Mark's downfall were not easy, but they were finally free. Emily Parker stepped into her new life with caution at first, carrying the weight of her scars. Yet with each passing day, the burden grew lighter. She had survived the fire, the lies, the humiliation. And now, she was no longer a victim. She was a mother, a survivor, and a woman reborn. Her son, Noah, was born strong and healthy. From the moment she held him in her arms, Emily felt every wound in her heart begin to heal. His small fingers curled around hers, anchoring her to a future she once thought impossible. "It's just you and me, little one," she whispered through tears of joy. "But that's all we'll ever need." With Grace by her side, Emily rebuilt her life. Grace became more than a neighbor, she was family. Together, they created a home filled with love and safety, something Emily had never truly known before. The scars on her hand remained, but instead of hiding them, Emily wore them proudly. They were no longer symbols of pain. They were proof of survival. She returned to work part-time as an accountant, balancing motherhood with independence. The routine gave her strength, and every paycheck reminded her that she no longer relied on anyone who could hurt her. Slowly, Emily regained her confidence, and soon she became a quiet inspiration to other women in the community. Grace often encouraged her to share her story, and eventually, Emily did. At a local support group for survivors of abuse, Emily stood in front of a small circle of women, her voice steady though her heart pounded. She told them about the nights of silence, the humiliation, the fire, and finally the strength she found in fighting back. Some women cried, others nodded silently, but all of them listened. "You are not weak," she told them firmly. "You are stronger than you realize. No man, no abuser, no liar has the right to define your worth. If I can survive, so can you." Her words rippled through the room, planting seeds of hope just as Grace had once done for her. It was a full circle, a cycle of pain turned into power. Meanwhile, Mark's fate became a cautionary tale whispered across Houston. The once proud man was now a ghost, living alone in poverty and sickness. Occasionally, Emily heard rumors of his condition, how Sophie had abandoned him, how his health had left him dependent on strangers. But she no longer felt fear when she thought of him. Only pity. He had destroyed himself with his own hands. One evening, Emily sat on the porch with Grace, watching Noah play in the yard. The setting sun bathed the sky in gold, and the sound of her son's laughter filled the air. She turned to Grace and said softly, "For so long I thought I'd never have peace. But now, I do." Grace smiled knowingly. "That's because you chose it, you fought for it, and you won." Emily looked out at her son, her heart full. She had faced fire and darkness, but now she stood in the light. And her story carried one lasting truth. Women are not weak, and when they rise, no one can silence them. So, my dear friends, the story has come to its close. And if you are still here with me right now, it means something deep inside this journey touched your heart. Emily's fight wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming her dignity, her freedom, her voice. As the Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "You may fetter my leg, but not even Zeus himself has the power to break my freedom of choice." That's what Emily discovered. Even in pain, she still had the power to rise. This story is a mirror for us all. No matter how dark the night feels, there is always a dawn waiting if we refuse to give up. Let this be your reminder. Your scars don't define your weakness. They prove your strength. If this story touched you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need hope, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep spreading voices of courage, healing, and truth.